Hello, smokers, tokers, dopers, and dropouts. It's me, the god of ganja, Doobie Ruby McGangister. Bryce and Liz can't do the cold open today. They're on a little trip with Mary Jane's crazy brother, Delta 8, and they're too busy blowing tea to talk to you. They told me to tell you the episode today is a sticky, icky skunk fest for the true herb fans only. So pop out of that pre-roll. Pop out of it. Pop out of it, honey.
Pop out that pre-roll.
I know. Honey, I know. So pop out that pre-roll, light up that gravity bong, inhale that Thai stick, and smoke up that knife head. Ladies and gentlemen, prepare to smoke on that true ganjanon.
Ladies and gentlemen, psych! I would never smoke weed ever again. I would rather die publicly in a horrible way. I'd be on a fucking plane, right? And there's guys get up and like, we're gonna take this thing over. We're crashing this into the Pentagon. And I'd be like, I'd rather do this than smoke weed. That's what I'd tell the hijackers. Hello, my name is Bryce Belden.
Hello, everyone. I'm Liz. Also not smoking weed.
She has an unlit doob in the corner of her mouth that kind of is like stuck to her, like a kind of 50s cigarette style that just like bobs up and down when she talks.
Ew.
So it's both dry and wet.
I can like feel that.
You can.
Yeah, I
it's
don't
a little
like
bit,
it.
Little flakes are getting in your mouth.
Yeah, gross.
We're of course joined with the doubly stoned young Chomsky, and then thank you, Doobie Ruby McAllister, for lending some of your stoned voice work. You smoke weed?
I'm actually starting to smoke weed again. I've decided this fall I'm going to smoke weed twice a week.
Are you scheduling it?
Yeah, because I hate weed. But I think this fall, what if I smoke weed twice a week, read a book? Hello.
Yeah, hello.
That's called being an adult.
This little like pumpkin spice vibe.
Yeah, it's like just smoke a little joint, read a book, a great American novel.
Dreiser? Theodore Dreiser?
Some Sister Carrie.
I will call the cops on you if I see you doing that. Folks, this is a episode of True Ganjanon, a loose mini-series that we are starting. In fact, actually, the show is going to be mostly about weed, the weed industry, what's going on in Humboldt. It's not about any of that.
It's only vaguely about weed, too.
It's kind of about... This episode is not about weed.
It's not at all.
I'm also not interviewing Ruby. She's just at our studio right now.
Ruby's just hanging out. Sorry, guys. I mean, we could. Ruby, how's it going? How are you?
Well, she likes weed. She already answered, so...
Oh, okay.
You are a criminal.
100%.
Or are you a cop?
Sort of a
that
sexy
has
question.
more to do with our episode today.
Folks, we have yet another crazy paranoid author. He's the guy himself is not paranoid, but he's writing about a paranoid subject. We are talking today with Sean Howe, the author of Agents of Chaos, a book about Tom Forcade, who was the founder of High Times magazine. Now, for people like Liz, Ruby, Young Chomsky, that was it functions as like a Playboy type magazine for them. They open the centerfolds, they see the crystals on the kind bud, they see the purple ganja, they see the green ganja. That's sort of like their different, like, oh, I'm into this race of people, I'm into this race of people.
And
there's
then,
a racist to them.
When mom walks in, we stuff him under the bed real quick.
Oh, I can't let her see. And of course, the famous bong is the naked woman in real life for these potheads here. The famous bong.
That's a curious way of saying that.
When was the last time any of you guys, I want to actually, an honest question for everyone in the room. Was the last time anyone here used a bong?
I don't know. But I love how they look.
I love
how they look.
Do you?
Wouldn't you want like a gorgeous bong in the middle of this
No.
room right
Yeah,
now?
they're
I did
decoration.
They're
so
fabulous.
much time on Haight Street in my 20s.
You did, yeah.
That I like cannot see a smoke shop. I go into convulsions. I can't see this shit.
Liz had, when we were younger, Liz had the craziest, SpongeBob?
100%.
The square pants. Liz had this thing. I've never seen it. It was not a cylindrical style bong. It was a full rectangular bong. Full size, life size SpongeBob. You smoked out of his nose.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Liz would just build these little
way.
campfires underneath his, what would be his crotch if he was a human, and just put some kind bud in there and just, she smoked saltwater bong.
That's
that was
so
what
not
Liz
true.
was sort of famous
Everyone
for.
knows this is fake.
It was
Because
well,
it was Squidward.
It was Squidward. Liz, of course, with her famous
You're sort of a
life-size
Squidward
Squidward
girl.
bong.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we have a fantastic interview right now with the author of Agents of Chaos. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the icky, sticky, cush half hour. Please lay down on my chaise. Let me drape a little blanket over you. Put on some, what's the fucking incense that they always have? Nag champa. Let me put some champa on, maybe all around. And then point a gun at your head and ask if you work for the police. Hello, today on TrueAnon, we have with us guest Sean Howe, author of Agents, or is it Agents of Chaos? It's Agent of Chaos. It's Agents, plural, of Chaos. The story of Tom Forcade, who is the founder of High Times. Sean is you were a journalist, but now you're just an author. I feel like you've been
just
an author
now.
for a long time.
Just a guy.
An author. And also author of Marvel, The Untold Story, and unless I got that title wrong.
Marvel Comics, The Untold Story?
Marvel
but that's good
Comics,
enough.
Untold Story.
Yeah.
I know. I said it and I panicked. I was like, fuck, I should just look at my
Everyone knew
stupid-
what you were talking about.
You know what I'm talking about. Sean, welcome to the show. Thank you for showing up. And let me ask the first question. Do you smoke weed?
I sometimes do.
It's too strong now, right?
We did a reading and they were offering 10 milligram mocktails, which I thought was kind of crazy.
Wait, what does that mean? Neither of us smoke weed, so you have to explain this like I'm 5 years old.
Yeah, for me, like 3 milligrams is like, I'm not going to freak out.
Okay.
And so I don't know how many people got home afterward. It would have kicked in after they were at the reading,
Yeah.
which is kind of a funny.
So like afterwards,
Way to
they
do
would have been
things.
driving home and then just completely swerved off the BQE.
Right.
Great timing.
So last night I did go up there. I went to this reading, to Sean's reading, and there was an open bar, or there was a bar at this bookstore, and I said, oh, well, how funky. Maybe I'll order
bar in a
myself
bookstore?
a funky little mocktail. And I go up there, and they do indeed have a sign that says mocktails. I don't drink because, unlike many people in your book, I conquered my substance abuse issue. So I go up there, and I'm like, hey, let me get a mock pina colada. The lady says, no problem. And then I look at the sign a little closer, and I was like, sorry, does this have weed in it? And she's like, yeah, it's all weed
You can't
drinks.
call it a mocktail, but have weed in it.
It makes a mockery of cocktails, is what
Yeah.
it does.
Yeah.
And I said, can you do it sans weed? And she said yes, and gave me basically what amounted to a food.
So you hadn't pounded it
Pineapple
already.
juice.
I hadn't
That was
had
good.
it. But
Yeah.
weed, even beyond everything else, weed drives me crazy. So if
Yeah.
I had actually drank weed at your thing last night, it would have been an incident.
Yeah.
Have you heard of the
Drink
Citizen app?
weed is crazy. I don't like
Drinking the
this
weed?
feature.
I don't like
We
it.
have a long-standing bugbear about the crazy weed now because we were on tour. We kept having all these faintings in the audience, and we were convinced it's because the weed is too strong.
Because we investigate and many tokes prior to these faintings.
It was the mocktails.
It was the mocktails.
At
It's
the
the
events.
infusions. So your book, the reason we're not bringing up weed because you look stoned. You look totally normal. But we are bringing up weed because the subject of your book, Thomas King Forcade, if that is your real name, was the founder of High Times magazine, which I assume everybody listening knows is the weed magazine. But let me ask you this, just to establish who the fuck we're talking about here. Who is Thomas Forcade, which is a crazy name to begin with? What's this guy's story? Why'd you write a book about him?
Yeah, so I don't even really know at this point who he was.
Yeah.
I got a lot closer to solving that mystery. His real name was Gary Goodson, although people didn't know that at the time when he kind of appeared on the scene in 1969 and insinuated himself into the echelons of the counterculture and radical politics, and immediately aroused everyone's suspicion. Everyone thought he was a cop, but somehow he continued to gain power and influence within that world. And throughout the early 70s, he was kind of overseeing the underground newspaper network in America. And after a long, crazy hijinks in the summer of 1972, which ended with him being indicted on a firebombing offense from the Republican National Convention. He went underground, reemerged with High Times magazine in 74, and the magazine we all know and love.
And then he died.
And then
78, right?
He died in 78 at the age of 33. As someone said at one of the readings, very sort of suspiciously, that's a lot of Christian symbology.
Well, he was. I was actually sort of surprised to find at least in the beginning of his sojourn into the radical media and sort of the radical milieu, a self-identified Christian to a point.
Yeah, I think that was mostly as a way to kind of keep police off of his trail. He did a lot of traveling in a big school bus and had kind of an underground printing press in the back of this. So he would go from town to town and give out his newspaper and sell drugs on the road. And if they got pulled over, he would don like a priest's outfit and he would lead all the other people in the van singing hymns. And so they would get off with a warning usually.
Yeah, you can sort of pretend to be Jesus people.
Right.
What brought you to writing about him? Or like, how did you, like, what was it about him that felt like such, because I was reading the book and it seemed, that whole era is very chaotic. This time between kind of 68 to, when he died in 78, that kind of, let's say that's the decade of the 70s in a way. I know other people have said that before, right? But he seems to kind of embody a lot of this very like transitional, chaotic energy. And I'm wondering, like, what was it so much about him that kind of you keyed in on?
Yeah, I think it was kind of the fact that he was kind of weaving in and out of all these different subcultures, and he seemed to just, insinuate himself everywhere. And so he pops up in, the world of magazine journalism, obviously, but also, leftist radical politics, the punk rock movement, and he just seemed like, how have I never heard of this guy who
totally
has had kind of an outsized influence, in several categories. For one thing, he was a First Amendment warrior. He battled for press credentials that were later used in the CNN versus Trump case when Jim Acosta was kicked out of press access for the White House, and he kind of blazed a trail for underground reporters being welcomed into the mainstream.
Yeah, because he starts out, one thing that your book makes pretty clear, and you can't kind of escape noticing, is this guy really does kind of come out of nowhere with an assumed name and is able to, within like a year of his sort of appearance on the scene, he's running something called the Underground Press Syndicate.
Yeah.
Pretty much single-handedly. And it was an organization that existed prior to his arrival, but he seemed like nobody wanted to do it anymore. And he kind of just like took the reins. And, I used to go to the shop in the Tenderloin in San Francisco called The Magazine. And it was run by 5 pretty much identical guys that all kind of were bald with beards and kind of the same height. It was sort of like a gnome situation. And it was mostly like male erotica, like old photographs and stuff like that, and then some like magazines. But in the back, there was a massive collection of like underground papers from the 1960s. And so I used to go buy like old copies of the Berkeley Barb. I got a copy of Slash magazine, so that's much later in the 70s. But really, it was cool. And I would, kind of look through these underground papers. They were pretty cheap. I'd buy them. And I think something that sort of people might know about some of the big ones, like the Berkeley Barb. I think that's kind of probably the most famous one.
Yeah.
And those were kind of the precursor to like the alt weeklies that now have mostly disappeared. But, that if you are of a certain age, meaning probably above 22, you remember from whatever town you're from. And they had a massive presence back then. I mean, I know in the book, I think Tom is quoted as saying that there's like 6 million readers across America of these things. And I mean, it's notable that like the thing that he heads for immediately, and this is whether he's a cop or not a cop. It's just notable that the thing he heads for immediately is like, I want to be in charge of essentially like the wire service for the underground newspapers.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I found out pretty early in my research that I think really led me down a rabbit hole was he kind of came out of nowhere, and on August 15th, 1967, he contacted the East Village Other, which was the East Village underground newspaper, and he said, look, I want to help in any way I can. He previously had been a business major in college and had worked for the Air Guard in Arizona. Mm-hmm. He'd had a small military service. And then suddenly he attaches himself to this counterculture movement. It turns out that August 15th, 1967 is also the same day that the CIA's Chaos program started. And so I thought, oh my God, like it's too perfect.
Yeah.
For our listeners who don't know, can you explain real quick
sure.
what just a kind of general idea of what the Chaos program was?
MH Chaos?
Chaos is pretty much the CIA equivalent of COINTELPRO. So, infiltrating the left, the civil rights movement, various non-down-the-middle mainstream parts of America that, need to be cleaned up or wiped out. Forcade made all of the people who were kind of in his orbit read a book called Agents of Chaos, a science fiction novel, kind of a pulpy science fiction novel about the establishment and then the counter-establishment and then this third force that comes in and shakes everything up. So I thought this guy was obviously an agent of the Chaos program.
Yeah.
Could it be any more clear? It's not maybe the smoking gun that I hoped it would be or thought it might be, but it's one of many sort of circumstantial things that make your eyes pop out a little.
In the book, there are several quotes kind of throughout his basically decade-long career from people that were friends with him, that are either them reporting to him that in letters like, hey, like, we're chill, but like a lot of my friends think you're in the CIA, or like other people giving you quotes later, basically being like, the guy was a fucking agent. And that seems to be something that like is throughout the book kind of like hangs over. I mean, the book, it's the name, I'm sure not to insinuate anything, but I was like, that's a very interesting title for your book, calling it Agents of Chaos, because that obviously is, any sort of student of the 60s would remember that was a pretty big part of it, the MH Chaos.
Right.
It would seem sort of to somebody who was just to go over this guy's life, it's like, wow, there's a lot of really, he was really getting away with a lot of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Like, there's a lot of instances throughout the book where he's sort of in these radical scenes and a lot of other people are getting busted. Not that he doesn't get busted himself, ever. He does. Mm-hmm. But a lot of guys are getting busted, and Tom's kind of just, getting away scot-free. And, there's multiple readings in that of that stuff within the book as well. Like, there's people who are like, well, it's just like, that's the way it happened this time. Or some people being like, I don't know why he got away, And did you wrestle with that? Like, while writing the book, you're like, did you come in with like a preconceived notion? You kind of hinted at that right then. Like, this guy's probably like, something's up with this guy. And then how did that change as you were writing the book?
Yeah. Well, it kind of ebbed and flowed a little bit. I would kind of go back and forth thinking like, oh my God, like this person that I just interviewed, like they probably have a tap on my phone. I got like 4 years into it. I think I was starting to like get the paranoia of what I was researching was starting to rub off on me. I mean, not to mention, you're talking to a lot of people who are paranoid themselves. It's only natural that you start to go a little nutty. But yeah, his arrest record is pretty clean considering what he was up to. And I had access to a lot of FBI files, which were really helpful. But the FBI files would reference, for instance, a plot that the Secret Service was investigating about Forcade's alleged plot to assassinate Nixon. And there were no Secret Service files that were responsive to searches. There were no drug files on Forcade. There were no DEA or the predecessor BNDD files on Forcade. And for someone who was selling a lot of drugs and was, just pretty openly advocating drug use, I thought that was strange. But that doesn't really prove anything either. It's a hard thing to prove that someone is not a spook or that they are a spook.
Yeah.
So that can be maddening when you're trying to figure out someone's motivations. Someone who also, I should say, Forcade really enjoyed kind of playing the heavy, and he liked making people wonder who he was. He didn't like having his face photographed, and he would say provocative things to people, and he would claim to be parts of groups that he wasn't a part of, and he would use assumed names for things that he wrote, and his name was never in High Times while he was alive. So there was all this mystery that he was cultivating, and meanwhile there are people saying this guy's pretty mysterious. And, he wasn't doing much to kind of assure people he was cool.
It's funny you say that you kind of went through the looking glass a little bit in it when you were writing the book. Like you kind of assumed some of the or started feeling some of that kind of paranoia that the people in the book clearly felt. Because, I mean, I think reading the book, I felt that. Like there's so much going on and kind of weaving through different milieus, and everyone throughout the years that the book document just seems crazy fucking paranoid about everything. And it's not just from the smoking the weed and all of the obviously there's a lot of cops around, but it's like everyone is constantly accusing everyone else of being in bed with the government or having mysterious motivations, or it really comes across as like this really fucking insane time, like really chaotic.
Yeah. I love the cover of the book, but sometimes it's Bill Sienkiewicz, a comics artist that I've loved since I was like 10 years old. But sometimes I think like maybe that two Spider-Mans pointing at each other meme would be like also the perfect cover for this book.
Yeah.
Because there's so much, there's so many accusations going around, and it's hard to know like what to trust. And I think that's something that, felt as I was working on it very relevant to a lot of the political situation today. There's so many factions of people across the political spectrum that put the snitch jacket on one another. And so I just I guess I really wanted to show also how the various government programs that surveilled activists, that was not just, it's not so much that resulted in people going to jail, it's that it injected all of this paranoia into the movement, which, was not very helpful to the movement's goals.
No, I mean, I think that, like, it's funny how fitting, like, a name Chaos, I guess, was to the CIA operation. But, like,
Yeah.
I think that's one of the thing that, like, I think a lot of people think of, like, COINTELPRO. Obviously, the two big aspects of it, right, were, like, political assassinations and infiltration. And infiltration, obviously, to get people busted or whatever, to spy on people. But what that infiltration and what those assassinations engendered, is that the word? Engendered in activist groups was this just broad sense of paranoia to where, like, it was this sort of self-perpetuating thing where you actually, I mean, they did have agents in most of these groups, but, you know, even if there wasn't an agent present, you had this suspicion of everybody around you being a police agent. And that drove, I mean, Panthers, it drove a lot of those guys insane.
Right.
And the groups that Forcade was most closely linked to were groups that we haven't really talked about much on this show, which were the Yippies and their sort of counterpart, the Zippies. And
The American Bolshevik Menshevik.
Yes.
Post 68.
Listeners might know one of the more famous Yippies, Abbie Hoffman. He wrote Steal This Book. I remember I read that when I was like 13 and was, I gotta be honest with you, not really germane to my life at that point. I just remember the one part they were like, steal a giant wire spool if you need a coffee table in your house. I was like, well, my parents have a...
Bruce once on the podcast
Coffee
called him the
table.
famously annoying Abbie Hoffman, and it's been stuck in my brain.
He's famous for being annoying.
It's been stuck in my brain like a like kind of Trumpist, like Trumpian kind of quote, you know, where his like manner gets stuck. It's stuck in my craw, and now I can only, whenever I see Abbie Hoffman or read Abbie Hoffman's name, I just read it as the famously annoying Abbie Hoffman.
But talk to us about that scene, right? Because Forcade went from like the kind of underground newspaper scene, which was a lot of like, you know, all across the country. He was kind of running this press syndicate. And then he sort of makes this move. He starts hanging out with some more of the New York crowd, which was like Abbie Hoffman, you know, Jerry Rubin and these guys. What is up with that? Like, what were the fucking Yippies? What were all these kind of like New York psycho groups?
Yeah. So the Yippies were basically, I think their main objective was to kind of merge the counterculture and the political left, which for a while were pretty separate. You know, there were the like Students for a Democratic Society crowd was often just like kind of clean cut. Sometimes, you know, going along with kind of these Marxist ideals. There was the Clean for Eugene McCarthy fans. And then there were the dirty hippies who were into rock music and doing drugs. And that's kind of like how, those were the stereotypes. And the Yippies basically wanted to embrace the counterculture stuff and use that as kind of a vehicle to sell the political stuff. And they did that through a lot of kind of high profile pranks. You know, they threw money out on the stock exchange floor and watched people fight for it, things like that. And they became like household names, especially after the Chicago 7 trial, which there's a terrible Aaron Sorkin.
Oh yes,
movie.
Aaron Sorkin made a movie about that.
He did?
and for Netflix, I think.
Oh, shit,
And I think
totally
it came out.
missed this.
And my
Was
brain,
this a COVID thing?
I might be doing a Hassan Minaj emotional truth right now, but I think it came out during October 20, or not October, excuse me, like summer of 2020, like during the BLM stuff.
Oh,
but my brain might just be making that fact up.
I try not to talk trash about things, but it was pretty terrible.
I think
And,
Sorkin's not listening. You're good.
Yeah.
You're good.
It was Sacha Baron Cohen as Abbie Hoffman
Not a
and
fan.
that Succession method actor guy as
that
Jerry
little
Rubin.
freak?
Yeah.
He was Jerry Rubin?
Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I can see
Yeah, I
that.
can see that. I hate Jerry Rubin. I will talk shit. I know. Maybe you don't. You know some of these people. Jerry Rubin has been. I haven't liked Jerry Rubin since I found out who he was a long time ago. But so these guys were like. These guys were. They weren't the merry pranksters, although they knew some of them. But they were pranksters. Like they were sort of like theater
kids.
Yeah, I mean
Surrealist theater kids.
surrealist theater kids. Yeah.
Inspired at least by.
And that seems to be a theme throughout the book too, is that like, in a lot of the, like if you read like Revolution's End or like any of these sort of like histories of like the radical left in the 1960s, it really like a lot of the countercultural movement stuff is kind of left out of it because like, they're like, we're not like the hippies. Like we're not just like That was we're more Marxist. That was more like anarchic.
Yeah.
And there is that a lot of this in your book is like actually these people who sort of see themselves as political actors, like you said, trying to sort of merge both of these two scenes that were kind of existing side by side.
Yeah.
And both have broadly involved in the anti-war movement, but weren't really united. And I think a big part of you talk a lot about festivals, about music festivals in the book, and Woodstock Nation, and that sort of seems to be Woodstock is a big link because you talk about how some of the underground press, like Woodstock, was advertised to the underground press, and the underground press were basically able to secure like a contract to print brochures or whatever.
Yeah. That
didn't seem to fully work out. But I think a lot of the guys, a lot of sort of the political actors you're talking about, Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, et al., sort of viewed Woodstock like, oh my God, we had all these young people together. Like, we got to spread this across. This is like a political movement. And they spend the next several years kind of trying to replicate the magic of that.
Right. Yeah. Forcade had a good name for the, I don't know if it was his original name, but he called the politicos and the pot smokers the fists and the heads.
That's kind of cool. Heads I know, but fists is pretty. That's nice.
Yeah. And so getting those two groups on the same page was like this big objective, and using like rock and roll, man. That was like how they were going to do it, and they saw, I think, the cultural moment of Woodstock as this way that they could tap into activism. And of course, like, Abby Hoffman famously got up and tried to give a political speech at Woodstock, and Pete Townsend smashed him with his guitar.
Yep.
It
But
didn't
if it
go
wasn't
so well.
so annoying, maybe it would have ended up differently.
Yeah.
So the thing is that Forcade was actually involved in the editing of that book, Steal This Book. He contributed some writing to it, and he had this falling out with Abby Hoffman. And that's kind of what kicked off the Zippies. So Forcade decides that Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin are sellouts and that they are not pure enough.
Hip capitalists.
Well,
that seems to be something that Jerry Rubin called Forcade, but I'm sure that was...
everybody...
Again, Spider-Man pointing me.
They're all hip capitalists.
Right.
Well, hip, I don't know, but definitely
at the time.
Everyone's an operator.
Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, and Ed Sanders got like $33,000 to write a book about the 72 presidential election campaign, and they called it Vote. And Forcade really seized on this as like, just evidence of how dirty they were, and that they were sitting up in their nice hotel room at the conventions, and they weren't down in the streets with the people. And so the Zippies were born to kind of hold the feet of the Yippies to the fire, and this became kind of a big clash in the summer of '72 that got a lot of media attention that has sort of faded into the background. But if you go back to the newspapers, there was like a lot of coverage of the Zippies
and Zippies split.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, with names like those, hard not to write
of course,
about them.
I will say this. I mean, TrueAnon, I would say our sort of unofficial fourth member would be the classic Zippy the Pinhead. And of course, his faithful friend, the Doggy Dinerhead.
Sure.
Who's massive influence on me throughout my life. You mentioned 72. This was the Miami. Was that the DNC that took place? It was in Miami.
It was happening in both, because the DNC and the RNC were held in Miami that year.
Yeah. So sick, Miami.
They don't do that anymore.
I can't remember.
They don't have them in the same city anymore.
There's one passage from the book which is just astounding. There's a lot of these kind of things in the book, but this was, I think, stood out to me more than the other ones. And I think it's emblematic of a lot of the sort of the themes in the book. Is at one point you're kind of covering you're mentioning this Vietnam veteran against the war meeting in Miami, and that Forcade was looks like he was likely at. Or there was at least a representative from the Zippies at. And at this meeting, a member of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War kind of gets up and says, we're going to have this militant organization. We're going to make these makeshift weapons to get the cops off of the horses and like kind of riles everyone up into this violent mood. And it's like, we're going to do all these violent things. And then afterwards, immediately confesses to other members of the organization that he works for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He's an FBI agent.
Right.
And then those guys are like, all good, we'll just use him against the FBI. They go down to meet with this Cuban guy to kind of make peace so that the Cubans, exiles, don't come and beat the shit out of him.
Right.
And then the Cuban guy ends up being like, all good, I can't guarantee anything about the Cubans. I can sell you guys some guns, though. And they're like, absolutely. Cuban guy also working for the FBI. And these guys get entrapped in this big thing. And that to me, I mean, that is these sort of like semi-naive guys who want to be these sort of like, political actors, but aren't really like, they think that they can use the system against itself.
Yeah.
And that happens so many times within the book. I mean, not only with sort of the hip capitalists who are like not the hip capitalists, the Yippies and the Zippies, although maybe the shoe fits, think that they can use this media attention against the media. Or the I think it's the medicine ball caravan.
Yeah.
Sort of the traveling Woodstock that Forcade kind of comes into as like as a loyal opposition member, and
Right.
like just throughout, and even with High Times, in a sense, like
Absolutely.
all of these guys are just like, they think that they can use, they see that they're being used by an outside force, and they're like, maybe I can use this outside force against itself.
Right.
And
Right. The
it
tools
seems
of
to
the
be-
master. Right.
Exactly.
Yes,
And it seems
totally.
to be a legacy of failure.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, capitalism is one of the big forces that they think that, they can employ to achieve their ends. And, it turns out that like capitalism is pretty hard to beat at its own game. And I think one of the things that really became a conflict in Forcade's life was when High Times became this big success. He seemed to wrestle with, have I sold out, essentially? And he tried to like shut down the magazine a few times. He fired the whole staff, and then he would hire them back.
Yeah.
But it was this constant, this dichotomy between making a lot of money and then putting that money into the movement, or just like staying true and staying pure. And many people have never figured this out. I don't know if anyone has.
It's a tough one. Yeah. It's the effect of altruism gambit. I mean, let's talk about High Times, because that's another little theme that runs through the book is fucking weed. And these guys were dopers. These guys were smoking pot, marijuana, and getting very high. And that seems to be like, that's a funny thing also, sort of the split between the counterculture and like the politicos or whatever, the fists and the heads.
Yeah.
Is that the fists were like, maybe you shouldn't really be smoking pot so much. Like, we got to like talk to working class people or whatever, and like, try to maybe get jobs at factories and stuff like that. Whereas a lot of the heads were like, we got to smoke as much fucking weed as possible. Everybody smokes weed. And their whole thing was, and I knew this, but it's spelled out several times in the book with direct quotes from people like, listen, if everybody smokes weed, they will like be more like down. Their minds will be more open to like alternative ways of living.
Right.
Which I will say now, with full hindsight, 2023 history, did not turn out to be the case. I think more people smoke weed than ever in history, and things are dog shit.
Right.
But the theme of like marijuana legalization also runs through this as well. And a lot of people getting busted for pot. And that is sort of like the one, I guess, like kind of semi-victory that kind of comes out, not directly from these guys, but from that arc, is that like, I guess weed's legal in New York kind of now. Right.
I mean, I do think that there's something to be said for, marijuana making people question systems, whether or not that follows through that they do anything about it. And I also think that smoking weed does not necessarily help with your paranoia. It also does not help give you a sense of like what's real and what's the truth.
Interesting.
Facts.
And it might even like lead to a lot of conspiracy theories that don't help out a lot. But I think I understand where that impulse comes from.
Yeah.
That like you start questioning things, and that's good to an extent. But if you're always questioning everything, then you're in trouble.
But it's funny, you to keep bringing up the Spider-Man meme thing. I mean, to see the kind of like leveling this criticism, I mean, I think rightly, at the Yippies for trying to kind of button up and subsume the movement into something else. They're sort of doing the same thing where they're like, well, what if we just made like smoking weed political? You know what I mean? Or like, what if all the political stuff was actually just about smoking weed? Like kind of doing it both ways.
Yeah.
And it didn't really end up going anywhere. But it does seem like Forcade, like we said, kind of had a bunch of problems with that too.
Yeah.
He wasn't totally comfortable with all of it.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that there's always going to be somebody to like rise up and say like, you are not radical enough.
Yeah.
That's me.
And that purer than thou thing is a tricky thing to navigate. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, weed not only looms large in terms of politics, but also in terms of Forcade's money making, because you drop a little bit into the book. I mean, you wait a little bit to drop this fact, but he was moving some what you might call weight, and was actually a pretty big weed dealer in New York, but also a weed trafficker, like getting it from South America and like getting it flown up in Classico Cessna style, which listeners will know how we feel about planes of that size. But he falls in with this guy, and I have to look at my notes right now because I'm going to mispronounce the guy's name. Bernstein.
Yeah.
In Florida.
I was thinking Bernstein, but I actually have no idea.
It's kind of a Bernstein situation.
Yeah.
Or if you're Jeremy Corbyn, Bernstein.
He follows in with this guy Bernstein in Florida, who is a like a realtor or something. I feel like it's a very Floridian profession, which
Fort Lauderdale real estate.
Classic. That's our number one listener demographic.
Yeah.
He falls in with this guy who also he tries to connect as an investor in various underground papers and stuff, Florida underground paper. And this guy is a weird cat. I mean, this is, I think, your closest link to me of like, well, there's something going on here, because this guy is like in with the DEA and in with the government, but also getting like busted by them.
Yeah. The whole Ken Bernstein epic was something that was really kind of always threatening to kind of pull me right out of the Forcade narrative.
Yeah, I get
that. Because he was involved in a lot of, there was kind of like this circular firing squad with a bunch of like ex-Bay of Pigs guys and arms dealers. And
the classic Florida.
I would have to gong after
cast
saying
of
it. Could you say
characters.
the name of one particular arms dealer who was associated with perhaps the manufacturing and sale of Mac 10 suppressors?
Is that Mitchell Werbell III?
Who has come up, I would say, more than any other name in TrueAnon history in various episodes. In fact, literally the last author before last that we interviewed, Werbell makes a appearance in his book as well.
That guy, another character, to put it mildly. Mitch Werbell, most famous for the Mac 10 silencer or suppressor. People who are into guns really don't like when you call things silencers.
It's fine. People can call it whatever they want. They don't suppress or silence, so it doesn't matter.
Right.
So, but like Bernstein was bringing in this weed from South America.
Yeah.
Werbell was also a weed dealer, which is a less focused on part of his lifestyle.
He kind of dealt everything, to be honest.
He did deal everything. And there's an interesting part of the book where you're talking about how he and Bernstein and Werbell, and Bernstein's in business with Forcade.
Yeah.
Bernstein, Tom Forcade's partner in weed trafficking, is also in business with Werbell, but they're both kind of ratting each other to the government, who are both investigating them for different things, but are also maybe employing both of them. I mean, definitely employing Werbell, maybe employing Bernstein.
Yeah. And then they've got like Watergate figures who are like testifying at their trials. Like Bud Crow, I think, took the stand. And people who are like tied up in like the JFK assassination conspiracy world. Yeah, that was a very impressive, close reading of what was going on there, because it's so. I had to diagram this stuff.
I was gonna say, did you end up with the red string on the wall, like trying to piece all this shit together?
More than just red string, yeah. I mean, and just like trying to keep the alliances that were always shifting, and it got to the point where you have different federal agencies like accusing the other federal agencies of lying.
Spider-Man.
Spider-Man meme again. Oh my God.
But yeah, the Ken Bernstein thing, the only way I knew about it was I found a letter from Bernstein to Forcade in Forcade's papers. And I mentioned it to this guy, Jerry Powers, who was a former underground newspaper editor who then became like a big Miami Beach kind of art world big money guy. And he was like, oh, that's what they were doing together. And then he told me these stories about like running into Bernstein and Forcade acting suspicious.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just speaks to the sort of compartmentalization that Forcade had in his life, right?
Yeah.
Because, and you do a good way of this is sort of how it ends up being in the book, is like you sort of reveal these other aspects of him that he's been doing this whole time throughout, like, as the book goes on, but you're like, actually, he's been selling weed for like this many years, or like, or this is his real name, and et cetera.
Right.
Which I want to get to in a second. But yeah, I mean, he was making some serious fucking, because one of the things that whenever I read about the 60s, I'm like, sorry, does anyone go to work in this world? Like, everyone's like, oh, I'm flying to the White Panthers convention, and I'm flying to this convention. It's like, bro,
no,
don't
they had
you
to wait till the 80s to get real jobs.
Exactly.
And then
Well,
they all
yeah.
made fucking bank.
Yes, yeah. Well, it's Jerry Rubin. But yeah. So I mean, that seems to be like the real way that Forcade was making some serious cash was selling weed in New York.
Yep. He was selling weed, and the other thing that he was making money off of was selling the microfilming rights to the underground papers, which of course kicked up. That made a bunch of other people suspicious that he was working
The little
for the
cameras.
government.
You're talking about?
Yeah.
Why were they doing? Who did he sell the rights to?
Bell and Howell. So it was going. So they were, microfiche that were going out to libraries, but also various government agencies were subscribing to get all these underground papers on microfilm, and so some of the people who actually did the microfilming said to me, like, what could he be but a cop?
I know there's a funny quote in the book where this woman's like, yeah, I did the microfilming. It must have been for the CIA or something. Like, it's just, who else wants microfilms of this stuff?
But I didn't mean to get you off of the weed.
Oh, no. I mean, that it's obviously that leads into High Times, right? Like, because this whole thing, like, all this stuff converges. Like, he's making all this money off of weed. He knows all these weed people.
Yeah.
Normal, NORML is like, which I gotta say, great name for an organization.
Yeah.
Normal. I mean, that's
Still around.
I know it is. It is. Gotta be, but that's gotta be one of the all-time greats for normal. How can no one else thought of that?
Can't argue with it.
Can't argue with it. Like, all right, fair enough.
Says what it is, right in the name.
What it is. But all of those kind of come together, and he starts High Times. And High Times becomes, it's funny because I always kind of put High Times, I slot it in with Playboy of that era, right?
Yeah.
Where it's
As you should, because I think
think
these kind of quote unquote revolutions, whether in drugs or in sex or whatever, it's all happening at the same time. And both of these guys are kind of figuring out how to literally put it into print and kind of make money off of it, right? And kind of, take over and direct the culture of those budding revolutions or whatever.
Right. These great like taboo breaking magazines, that hopefully can also make a lot of money for them on the side, in addition to changing the cultural norms. But one of the challenges that High Times faced in the beginning was that they couldn't get any distributors to pick it up, and so their way around that was they would give a lot of issues of the magazine to different drug dealers who would then distribute it along with like their bales of weed. So if you bought like a few bricks from somebody, they would pass along like some issues of High Times, like give this to your customers. So
old school marketing tactic.
Old school marketing.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the crazy
Second
things,
like
marketing.
door flyering.
when I was reading this book, I was like, because obviously I know about High Times. I actually have a lot of old, like, I guess like early 80s, late 70s issues, or no, like early mid 80s issues of High Times, because there's a lot of like Coke freebasing ads for freebasing equipment in them. But I didn't know that High Times also had like a trade publication for weed dealers.
Yeah.
And then like they had all these sort of like other publications too under the High Times umbrella. They were like really trying to like basically become not like a general interest weed magazine, but then also these various trade magazines for the industry as well.
Right. Dealer magazine is amazing.
So sick.
And putting their like, their skills with glossy photographs of various illegal substances to good use.
Well, they're like the Yippies of weed in a weird way. I mean, it's like, they were like, I don't know, like kind of getting their claws in because they thought that legalization was coming. We're going to set up and be the kind of like, we're going to run the new market and kind of like set up shop. At least that's what it always seemed like to me,
Yeah.
And kind of get in all over the place where they could.
Another thing that they were trying to do with High Times was to make some money that they could then pour back into the struggling alternative newspapers, which they had actually changed the name from Underground Press Syndicate to Alternative Press Syndicate by that point. And
that's a metaphor, by the way, for
the
change in the direction of the movement.
Right. And it was a very like considered like we don't want to be seen as like underground anymore.
Yeah.
And so like we're going to do like a lot of like where can you like show up for a wine tasting on like a Tuesday night listings
all weekly.
Yeah. And so that was as the draft was ending and the Paris peace talks were going on and the economy was starting to stagnate a little bit. There was this real kind of bleak fade out of the anti-war movement and the surrounding political movements, and the underground newspapers were kind of fading along with that. And I think High Times was this almost like last ditch attempt to get people, back involved.
Yeah, that's what it seems like. It's like it's like 74, it's over. You know what I mean? It's so over for everybody. Like you're dead, you're in jail, you're a speed freak, you're paranoid, or you're in college going straight. Like you went back to college and you're going straight now and you're about to invest in an Apple and be like the craziest landlord ever in the Bay Area in like 10 years. But yeah, I mean, it seems to be like a lot of, I mean, there's sort of that like thing about like the 60s casualties, you know what I mean? And like, there was a lot of those that littered through the 1970s. But one thing Forcade, I mean, he became a 60s, 70s, and 70s casualty, I guess, in 78. But one thing that is interesting about Forcade is he does have this sort of through line through this stuff. Like, he was really tapped in to a lot of... I mean, he wasn't at Woodstock, but he was at, all of these other sort of, like, big events, the Pop Festival, the Medicine Ball Caravan or whatever. But then also he's like gets into punk, and like that seems to be like that. I mean, David Peele is a sort of similar character, right?
Yeah.
David Peele, musician who was kind of glommed on to John Lennon, but like he started Elektra Records, I think. Am I wrong?
He started on Elektra Records.
Yeah. But he had. David Peele and the Lower East Side were kind of this like Fugs-like bands, and then like they also, I think their only really good song is actually a punk song from the 70s. I think called like King of Punk or something. Forcade sort of also like makes this journey from like this hippie groovy stuff into like he tours with the Sex Pistols at some point. And you mentioned at the reading last night that Johnny Rotten, who is. Boy, if you want to fright, Google Johnny Rotten modern day picture right now, and you will yelp at your goddamn phone like you just saw a ghost. Johnny Rotten thought he was a CIA agent.
Yeah, wrote about it in his memoir.
Yeah.
I think Forcade saw what the MC5 were to John Sinclair and the White Panthers.
Yeah.
As kind of like the house organ, not quite the mascot band, but
kind of.
Delivering the message, getting it out to the people. And I think Forcade saw David Peel maybe as being someone who could do that for him. And so he dragged David Peel out on the Medicine Ball Caravan, and they sort of like, heckled people with their music. And I think the appeal of the Sex Pistols was similar. I think Forcade saw the Sex Pistols as this great contrarian force, maybe even more than any interest he had in the music. It upset people.
Yeah.
And I think, I often think of Forcade and that Marx Brothers song, like whatever it is, I'm against it.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And I think Forcade just loved anything that would kind of like rattle people's cages a little bit. And that's what, and so he became obsessed with the Sex Pistols and followed them around on their U.S. tour, and hired a filmmaker to document it. And they were constantly getting thrown out of venues by Warner Brothers. There were some stories about kind of mixing it up with the Sex Pistols themselves. But it wasn't good. They weren't going to become Forcade's MC5.
Yeah, I mean, I think you, like, at one point, even Warner Brothers Security are like, you're a CIA agent to Forcade.
Yeah.
Which is, if you're getting called CIA by the security guard, it's time to leave the phone. That is my advice to you out there.
But it's funny because it seems like throughout his life, he, I know that we were talking before we started recording of just how like Zillig and like or Gumpian, Forrest Gumpian, like he is just popping up everywhere. But it seems like it was because he was always kind of chasing the next thing he thought that could like be the thing to wake people up.
Right.
Or like what's the thing that is going to be, this will be the next thing that makes people think differently. It's going to be weed. No, it's going to be punk. No, it's going to be, it's always just kind of like chasing that. I'm not going to say chasing that high, but chasing.
Say it. No, say it.
But no, that's what he wasn't. I don't even think it was that so much as just like a kind of like, he embodies that sort of desperation a little bit that I think a lot of people felt at the end of the 60s.
Yeah.
Of just like trying to figure out, wait, what just happened, and how do we like get it back together really quickly, because it's all sort of dissembling into something else throughout the 70s,
Right. And I think for some reason what you were saying made me think of like social media and people like trying to get things to catch on desperately.
Yeah.
And I wonder how Forcade would fare in these days.
He'd be totally fucking insane. The internet would have made him schizophrenic. Absolutely.
I mean, in a sense, the internet is kind of like an extension of the underground press syndicate, because it's this centralized but diffuse communication system.
Lots of naked girls and half-baked political opinions.
That's right. The legacy, the true legacy.
Yeah. And early IRC stuff is very like UPS coded.
Yes. Yeah, I would say too, like early internet stuff. Absolutely.
I think, Forcade also, he had a business school background, and he idolized J.P. Morgan and Howard Hughes when he was growing up.
Also, that's got to be a red flag for anyone who's like, let's align ourselves politically.
Right. He was a
You've the 1,000 guys changing their Hinge profile right now.
he was a big Ayn Rand disciple.
Another one. That's
for
the
a while.
class. Yeah. Who are your heroes? Ayn Rand and J.P. Morgan.
You know, what's his name? John Waters has that quote: "If someone doesn't have books at their house, don't fuck them," or whatever. Which bullshit.
Yeah. Also, which books?
Which books? And it's like, I'm sorry, I'm already here.
Yeah.
But people go to my house and like, oh, he has books. I can have sex with him. And yeah, we're talking Fountainhead. We're talking Atlas Shrugged. We're talking The God That Failed. And yeah, I have every copy of them. It's just mountains and mountains of them. And that's
Only
Liverpool.
those.
Sorry, I got us off track.
No. I was just going to say, I think in terms of him trying to always like chase the next big thing, I think that was his business school instincts and his marketing background. And I think that he, I tend to think that he probably really did have these ideals that have been questioned. But I think he really did believe in a lot of the stuff that he was preaching. But I think his way of trying to make those things manifest was through business tools.
But I think that's what makes I think that's what makes people really uncomfortable with trying to wrestle with this stuff, is that they want him. And I don't know if you felt this way going into the book, but it's like they want him or people like him to be cynical operators, because then it's a lot easier to deal with the kind of contradiction there of like someone who does have these sort of aspirational politics, but also has these instincts to sort of try to chase them or distribute them or rile people up through these sort of like business practices or marketing. I mean, we see all this all the time. These kind of like, we all seem to be children of, I don't know, like the marketing revolution that happened in like the 80s and 90s. And now even you see kids and kids younger than us, what they're steeped in makes me kind of want to blow my brains out Forcade style. But like, I mean, spoiler alert, but, you know, I think it makes people, it's almost easier to think someone like Forcade was, and maybe he was, I don't know, was a, you know, double agent trying to, you know, an agent of chaos trying to sow mistrust and paranoia among the movement and make things, you know, difficult for everyone, rather than maybe some of those instincts coming from the same place that a lot of the politics are coming from as well, and kind of trying to wrestle with that contradiction. I think that's one of the legacies of trying to deal with the new left, or what was the new left, is people not wanting to have that fucking conversation. Yeah.
I mean, he was a complicated personality, not just his persona, but his, you know, he was bipolar, and there was a lot that was not consistent about his behavior, and, you know, possibly also his motivations, and certainly his politics shifted at times. You know, another like kind of Rorschach blot that you can say, is that because he, you know, he didn't mean any of it, or did he actually change a lot? And I think he was cynical at times, but I don't think that he was, you know, kind of like the angel of death that that some people see him as.
Yeah, I mean that's you know, you mentioned Rorschach there, and it does seem like the book features quotes from people who just have these wildly different opinions of him. Some people were like, he changed my life, you know, sort of was like, he taught me to believe in myself, essentially, and like, great guy. And then other people being like, fucking, you know, hip capitalist, CIA, blah, 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 blah. And these two opinions are held by people who might have been in very similar situations with the same guy. And, you know, he does move from like different sort of political, I mean, not that the political scene itself changed very much during his time in it. I mean, it's really, one cannot stress enough, however, the period of like 67 to 72, 74 especially, like things just like the landscape changed radically. But I think that the thing that the book sort of reveals, I don't want to say halfway through, but like a third of the way through maybe, is that, I mean, there's essentially his actual background. You know, you mentioned the business school, but, you know, where he actually comes on, there's a very entertaining part sort of about his like, you know, ancestry and some troublemakers in his lineage or his family tree. But then also you include his psychological report from the Air Guard.
Right.
And I think they diagnosed him as paranoid schizophrenic. Yeah. Which at the time I was like, well, is that just him trying to like do a like, I'm crazy, don't send me to Vietnam kind of thing? Because my ass would be doing that.
Right. Classic tactic,
that, or get a boner during induction like Iggy Pop. But what did you make of that when you saw the psychological report?
Yeah, my interpretation of that changed like over the over the time I was working on it. I was like, oh, clearly he faked this to get, you know, out of the military. But then also the more I knew about his real life, you know, struggles that were not, you know, going to get him, that were not going to achieve anything for him. You know, his kind of crippling depressions and his really crazy outbursts. That profile started to really kind of fit in with that. Yeah.
There's another part of that section too that has a big bombshell, and I don't know if bombshell is the right word, but a sort of shocking passage. You know, his real name was Gary Goodson.
Right.
Goodson. Yeah. What a curse to be saddled with a name Good Son. But a hitchhiker, a dog was found with a severed arm in its mouth. And that was sort of traced back to the body of a hitchhiker that was found with his ID in the pocket, which is, first of all...
With Gary Goodson's ID.
Yeah.
With Gary Goodson's
Yeah.
ID, a.k.a. Thomas Forcade's ID.
Right.
What the fuck do you make of that?
Yeah.
Did he smoke this dude?
I don't think so. There was an old interview transcript with his mother, and she related this story about the police showing up, and that a body had been found with Tom Forcade's identification.
And this is prior to him being a known figure.
Right. This is in '69. This is right before he moves from Phoenix to New York.
So he's got a little bit of a name, but not.
Right. And, it's an interesting story, but I'm not sure if this is a tall tale. And then I found the newspaper clipping about that just lined up exactly about the dog finding this arm with someone's identification. They don't say what the identification is in the story. And I tried really hard to, try to dig up, there were no follow-up articles in the newspaper, and I couldn't track down any police records about this. So, maybe that's, maybe we can, do you guys have a team of sleuth listeners?
We
the
do
True
have
Crime
some very
podcasts?
paranoid listeners with quite a lot of time on their hands.
And they're all placed in the police department.
Yeah, that's true. Most of our listeners does mostly police officers, but on their off hours.
But I would love, that's one thing I would love to get to the bottom of that I just couldn't. And so it just kind of hangs there.
Adds to the mystery of this guy.
So the book, which by the way, me and Liz have both read it, fantastic book. I'm a big fan of history books in general, and especially history books about subjects that many of which are represented in this. I think a lot of our listeners will be fans of this book as well. What would you say, though, are the themes running through it, right? We sort of touched on the hip capitalism stuff and the paranoia stuff. What would you see while you were writing this book and after you finished it? What do you think of as the through lines through this book from the beginning? And we actually didn't really spend any time on this, but Tom Forcade did commit suicide in 1978.
Right.
I know that there's some theories that he was killed, but it looks pretty clearly like suicide.
Yeah.
What do you think are the themes that start sort of from the beginning, not even of his career, but from his life, that sort of arc to the end? What do you see there represented?
Yeah, I really think in some ways it's kind of a cautionary tale about maybe mistakes that that the left makes over and over again. Mm-hmm. I don't want to discount him as having had a good impact in his life, but I think that some of the political provocations, maybe just didn't really go anywhere. I think I think I wanted to get down kind of the story of what happened to the 60s, what connected the 60s to the 80s, which is usually a story that's told as, Altamont and then Watergate and then gas lines and hostages in Iran. And I thought...
and then everyone just skips into Reagan.
Yeah.
It's there's a little bit of the story missing.
And without sounding too much like delusions of grandeur, I kind of felt like the story of how things got there for a certain section of the baby boomer generation is never really told. And there's, of course, there's a lot about commodification and capitalism and its impact on the yippie to yuppie,
Yeah,
pipeline
right.
does get talked about, but I don't think it ever. I think it's often just kind of like. It's just like a bumper sticker saying. I don't.
Yeah.
I think that there are reasons that shift happened.
Yeah.
That I think are kind of important to get at.
Forcade's such a good character. I mean, I hate saying that about a person who was a real person, but a great figure, I'll say, to kind of trace that and complicate that bumper sticker, like you're saying, because he ultimately like couldn't make it into the 80s and into the kind of like, that transition into yuppiedom.
Right.
For as complicated as, however he felt his own, business practices or political practices or whatever, however he thought of himself, he couldn't do that. And so his sort of like, tracing or attempting to trace this like really wily figure. I mean, he's just a really, I hate just repeating the title of the book, but he's like so fucking chaotic, this dude.
That's a book author's dream. Just keep repeating the title.
Yeah. Right. We're all AdWords now. No, but it's true. Like he really is just like a crazy chaotic figure who is all over the place and really emblematic, like you're saying, of this. Yeah, I again, not to repeat myself, but this like dissembling of the 60s into whatever it became into the 80s, and all of these people trying to figure out like, well, now what the fuck do we do?
Yeah. And I think, your hatred of Jerry Rubin noted.
Yeah.
But I think, I think, people, I think can be really, kind of hard on the baby. Am I actually saying this? Can be really hard on like the baby boomers for like the.
It's okay. I think that too.
The arc of like
I'm a baby boomer
protests
apologist.
to
No one
like
wants to hear it.
like Jan Wenner's empire.
Yeah.
But I think there was not really a roadmap. And after things really got weird in like the early to mid 70s, people struggled to figure out where to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the dissolution of the draft alone, I think, was suddenly like, well, how do we, everything had kind of been piled into that,
Yeah.
And then suddenly it was like, oh, that's over now? Okay, well.
To speak of bugbears, one that has not been brought up on this show in a while, but used to be brought up regularly, is that my number one political position: bring back the motherfucking draft. Everything falls into place after that. Bring the draft back. All these groups are like, well, how come there's not a big anti-war movement? How come there's a... It's because no one cares if there's not a draft. No one's going to give a fuck if there's not a draft.
Yeah.
There just needs to be a draft. We got to put it back in, see what happens. I'm too old.
But I think also people were not prepared. I mean, now we're going to go into my weird apology tour for the baby boomers. I'm with you. But I think it's not apology as much as like a sensitivity, I guess, is that I don't think anyone was prepared for the way the state cracked down and how they did. And I think like, it's funny, we were talking about them being like these kind of like activists being sort of theater kids a little bit. Like I was thinking about that earlier when I was thinking about the SLA and like kind of, what we know now about the SLA, right?
Yeah.
And, everyone at home watching that raid live on TV when they went to LA,
Burn house
and they
down,
didn't find Patty Hearst, but it was like huge fucking shootout, 2 hours live TV or whatever. And like that being its own kind of theater performance by the state, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they're sort of like acting on both sides to kind of show in a kind of like, I don't know, like mousetrap for my Hamlet heads out there, like way of like, this is what we'll do, this is what we can do. Like, and that kind of, really pushing that paranoia into everyone as well.
Yeah.
Right? And that being its own kind of performance on live TV of this is what we can do and this is what we will do. And it just fucking breaking people's brains.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's not a lot that's written about sort of, there are the people who stayed political and they generally kind of, organized on local levels and joined city councils and
Sure. Or the Sierra
taught
Club.
school or the Sierra Club. But there was just really nothing national going on that replaced the anti-war movement.
Yeah, none of those groups. I mean, not a single. I mean, Progressive Labor Party put out a couple LPs. in the mid-70s. They did. Yeah.
PLPLP.
What I actually want to end on this. What were some threads from this that are like the most that you weren't able to tie up, or like that you'll like some of those things that are just like no one will ever know the answer. But like, what were some of the things that like you either came across while writing the book, maybe didn't even include in the book, or did include in the book, that you're just like, what the fuck was that? Like basically unsolved mysteries of the Tom Forcade saga, or even just that general scene.
Yeah. I think I could have really kept going on that Ken Bernstein tangent for a while longer. I think
you can sort of tell you wanted to in the book.
I mean, the smuggling stuff is also just like, that's another thing that has not been really documented that well, and so there's like a whole that could be like a whole world, a whole rabbit hole that I'm not sure I want to go into, but that's where the other big mysteries.
I have this book called Smugglers from the mid-70s. That's like written by a purported smuggler. It feels a little like high timesy, like maybe someone who kind of knows what they're talking about, gussing up their knowledge with some emotional truths. But it's like one of the big things I remember. There's a big section about smuggling watches. But one of the things that they talk about is like this really complicated method of like unscrewing a part of the bathroom in the airplane and hiding stuff in there, and then having someone get that exact plane somewhere else, like to evade customs. Like an international flight, you unscrew part of it and then find out if that international flight is now going on a domestic run, and then have someone get the next flight that's going to be on. But I'm like, that's so risky for some, you know what I mean? Like that's just, anyways, smuggling is... My ass would just be like, I have some weed on me. I knew a guy who used to fly from, you might be listening to this actually, used to fly from New York to San Francisco with like 200 fucking stamp bags of China White in his underwear. And I'm like,
how?
I don't know.
I was just at the airport and there's like, they have dogs everywhere.
This was like 2010. But there were still dogs, but I don't know. Wow. People tell me they're not looking for drugs, but I never believed that.
Do you think it was the bomb sniffing
They're like,
dog?
it's just bomb sniffing
I couldn't
stuff.
tell. It was September 11th, so. But I'm like, dude, if you're going to do September 11th, you're not going to do it the same day.
You flew on September 11th?
But you're not going to do like another September 11th on September 11th.
That's the best day to fly.
You're going to, like, you want your own day.
You want it like another one.
Yeah. You can't be like the second September 11th.
There's like 8 September. We've covered this in the show. There's like 10 September 11th.
But I'm saying if you're going to do the
same
same thing.
Yeah, you're right. You can't.
You can't just be like the do-over.
Copycat. Yeah, we don't like that.
Anyway, this is what I was thinking about.
Thank you so much for joining us. I got to tell you, once again, TrueAnon listeners, you will like this book. It is it's a fantastic book. Crazy researched. Seems like to you 8 years to do?
Oh, yeah, we're going to tell people that? Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good thing, right?
It is a good thing. Can you imagine if you're like, it only took me 6 months? You're like, well, maybe.
Yeah, it's like all those old.
Great.
I bled for this.
One crazy thing. So, talk about Zelig.
Yeah.
One crazy thing when I was reading the book, this motherfucker, Forcade, and somebody else, I can't remember who we went with, he snuck onto a cruise to watch the liftoff of the Apollo mission.
Rex Wiener.
That's a name. You got to get a wife as soon as possible and change your last name to hers. But
also the creator of the Ford Fairlane character, Rex.
Oh, interesting.
Just to bring it all back. Are the
Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers involved in any of this?
They were published in High Times.
There we go. I found a stack of those comic books in my my apartment building laundry room when I was 18, and I read every single one. But he sneaks onto this cruise to watch the Apollo liftoff, and he's like sitting there with Robert Heinlein, of course, the famous polyamorous fascist, but of course, I've read every single one of his books.
And author. And
I will say this, in his later career, incest advocate, but also former supporter of Upton Sinclair, his California gubernatorial run. But I'm like, that's a Zelig moment. To be like sitting there smoking weed with, and I don't know if Robert Heinlein was taking it, but sitting next to Robert Heinlein watching the Apollo liftoff. I mean, that is fucking crazy.
Right. And then, I think a bunch of these old science fiction writers were like talking about like their old buddy L. Ron Hubbard and, some kind of cocktail conversation about how Scientology might have, been started. And Norman Mailer and Hugh Downs were also like passing the joint around, which I always
there's
entertaining.
a funny
not so surprising that Norman Mailer was, but Hugh Downs, CBS News.
There's a funny Norman Mailer being like, all right, chill, to Tom Forcade in the book too. Anyways, the book is full of great scenes, weird scenes, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you guys so much.
I think a lot of people listening would actually really dig that book.
I do too.
Which we already said during the interview, but I want to repeat it. If you enjoyed Tom O'Neill's infamous Chaos, you'd really dig this book.
Yeah.
It's almost
fantastic.
Like, nice little continuation of some of the...
Also, a cool, you know what? Something I want to talk about, something that you want to talk about real quick, which I know we got to get out of here, but
Oh, no.
book covers.
Oh, yeah.
We got to talk about book covers real quick because I like the cover of Agents of Chaos. It's kind of a cool looking book cover. It looks like a movie poster.
Yeah. It's little Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Very
feeling.
much so. Yeah.
You got the kind of old school film guy look,
Very different than a lot of books you see on the shelves these days.
It's not green and blue, which is one thing. And it's not just like kind of abstract squiggle art.
We don't love that.
Or why do they all look the same? Or just two colors.
Like a book that's yellow.
I can't see that Emma Klein book anymore.
Who's Emma Klein?
My girl knows here.
Ruby, you know Emma?
She's nodding. She knows. My girl knows.
Are these females you know too?
It was like the book of the summer, according to people who...
Book of the summer?
But for like a month.
And
then everyone was like, just like every other fucking commodity cycle in this godforsaken country, everyone was like, oh my God, I love this book. And then immediately, oh my God, I hate this book.
I hate this book? You read the whole book and you hate it?
First of all, you can read it in an afternoon. It's a real quick read.
On the beach.
It's a summer
I
read.
read her
It's a summer
I
read.
liked her the other book better. Daddy?
Didn't she do the girl? She did the girls about the Manson girls, right?
I think Daddy was was it short stories?
You like Daddy though.
But that was also a book, one color book, yellow.
Here's the thing. What you want, I want two things in a book. Front cover. Your guy, I want to see what you're working with.
Mm-hmm.
I want to see what you're rocking with on there. Because that just, the tenor of the book changes, you know what I mean? I just want to see what you're rocking with. On the inside, I want the first 15 pages to be like, how are you feeling? You know, like what was going through your mind when you're writing this? And what people you use from your real life as basis for the characters in this, right? And I want you to tell me about them, and I want you to tell you the stories there. If you didn't use any, I think you're lying.
What the fuck are you talking about?
I have no idea. I am the author of the Cat Person screenplay, soon to be made into a major motion picture. And I gotta say it. I was the Cat Person guy.
I'm gonna say this real quick. Here's a take.
What?
If I was Nicholas Braun, which I'm not, thank God, I would not have done that movie.
He's too busy texting.
Everyone already sort of turned on him. Mm-hmm. I would say season 4, Succession. He hit mass. You know, it was again another commodity cycle, right? Another little taste cycle. That it's like now you want to be. Everyone already knows that you're out there texting the girls. You're bartending at the places. You're in the mix.
We don't want to be texting girls.
I will say this: a lot of women know other women who have texted with him. Mm-hmm. But I'll say this: I don't think I would take on a role where then I'm the
Cat Person?
The cat person.
I'm sorry. So
you want to be cast against type.
he method act. So he was method acting for years, and it's bad when he does it. But it's
doing
good
a
when
Jeremy
the other
Strong
guy does
going
it.
into. He was going into.
Just noted that some guys can method act, and when other guys do it, it's just they're too good at it. But
it was like the Aaron Rodgers lodge that he goes into. It's like the cat person psych. You don't know what I'm talking about, do you?
I'm only dimly aware of who Aaron Rodgers is. Football player?
Motherfucker. Yes.
Okay, then I
just tore his Achilles.
He just got hurt because of Taylor Swift?
No.
Oh.
No, he tore his Achilles on the first play because of the Curse of the Jets.
The Jets.
Yeah. Classic.
Great magazine.
Oh my God! Come on.
Well, I don't believe in curses. Actually, that's not true. I fully.
You
believe in
fully do.
curses.
You
I've
are
been
one of the most
cursed multiple times.
Yeah, I got a lot to say about
I walk
superstitions.
under ladders. I don't care. What do? Fall on me?
Well, that doesn't mean
I'll
you're not
sue you.
superstitious about other things.
That's
you just
true.
don't go classico.
I don't, yeah. Well, I'm not afraid of ladders. Actually, I'm afraid of ladders.
What about heights?
Yeah. Anyone's not afraid of heights. God wants you to die.
You know, my aunt's not afraid of heights.
Okay.
That's a lie.
Like,
That's
she
a
will just get
bullshit.
up there
How tall?
as tall as she wants. We have to talk her down.
Oh my God. All right, I have to pee really badly. We got to wrap this up.
My name is Liz.
My name, of course, is the cat person himself, Brace Belden. We are joined for this outro by Ruby McAllister and
Also known as Doobie McGangister.
Doobie McGangister, who, of course, is the lead actress in the new Cat Person movie. And then, of course, we have the titular cat from the story itself, the feline upon which all of those little words were tip-tapped out onto that MacBook. Young Chomsky, who is also moonlights as the producer of this podcast, which is called
TrueAnon. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.